welcome to our explainer. Today we're looking at a deeply moving, honestly just a beautifully written letter directed at a believer who is really struggling with the weight of the world. I mean, have you ever looked around at the news, the suffering, just the sheer difficulty of life and thought, man, I just want to check out? Well, you are definitely not alone. We're going to unpack a text written specifically for someone experiencing exactly that kind of profound spiritual burnout. So let's dive right into this.
We begin right here with the author's emotional hook. He's addressing a friend, a dear brother, who is just utterly overwhelmed by despair. This friend feels poisoned towards service. Just think about that phrase for a second. The very act of helping others has actually become toxic to him because of all the surrounding evil. He literally just wants to escape the world and go straight to heaven. The author recognized that this raw, exhausted sentiment is something so many others quietly share, which is exactly why he decided to take this private advice and make it public.
Right out of the gate, the author challenges this totally understandable desire to escape. He contrasts the wrong motivation for wanting heaven, which is simply running away from hardship or what he calls the birth pains of the world, with the right motivation. True desire for heaven shouldn't be about treating it like an evacuation helicopter, you know? Instead, it should be rooted in a pure, burning love for Jesus and a genuine desire to be with him. It completely reframes the believer's mindset from one of just, retreating to one of true devotion.
This brings us to part 1, Christ's example of endurance, which really serves as the ultimate blueprint for dealing with a broken world.
The author points out a really fascinating historical and theological perspective here. God always knew humanity would fail him. He knew the Israelites would betray him time and time again. Yet despite this absolute foreknowledge of failure and heartbreak, he didn't cancel his promise. No, he kept his word, arriving himself as Jesus. And Jesus, too, knew he'd be betrayed. He knew exactly what the world was going to do to him, but he didn't back down. He still embraced the cross for us all. It just sets a towering precedent for the weary believer.
So, this means Christ's sacrifice encompasses absolutely everyone. And that has some pretty radical implications for how we view the people causing the evil in the world. The text argues that Christ didn't just die for the oblivious sinners, but even for those who actively know him and oppose him. Because of this immense love, we as believers are inherently connected to them. They're our brothers and sisters. We belong to them out of love, even if they fight against it, because ultimately, every single one of us relies on that exact same grace.
To really drive this home, the author uses this famous biblical principle to completely reframe how we view so-called evil people. Look, when you see someone doing terrible things, it's so easy to just write them off, right? But this perspective flips the script. It suggests that these individuals are actually just potential believers who, precisely because they have so much to be forgiven for, might one day love God with a magnitude and gratitude far exceeding someone who has only ever made minor mistakes. It replaces our harsh judgment with a really radical kind of hope.
But what happens when we lose that hope? Well, we fall into part 2, the resentment trap, and we risk poisoning our own hearts.
Here we see the sheer danger of unchecked resentment. It's a 3-step trap. The author warns against becoming like the older brother of the prodigal son. Bitter, angry, feeling unfairly treated because you've been good while others have been bad. Step 1 is just harboring that anger. But step 2 is where it gets incredibly dangerous. That anger quickly morphs into hatred and contempt for the world. And step 3? That's the ultimate tragedy. By hating the world's evil so intensely, the believer ironically transforms into the very enemy they despise, gaining the likeness of the adversary.
To prevent this kind of arrogant, corrosive judgment, the text gently reminds the reader of an incredibly humbling equalizer. Since sin is ultimately deadly, there's really no point in keeping a scorecard. There's no need to divide sins into smaller ones that we commit and larger ones that the rest of the world commits. Why? Because the price paid for all of them was exactly the same. None of us are like God. We're all on completely equal footing when it comes to needing redemption.
To further explain this blinding nature of despair, let's look at part 3, Elijah in the cave.
The text notes a really profound truth about spiritual leadership and empathy here. To be convincing, to truly help others, a prophet must first eat a bitter leaf. You literally have to taste the bitterness of the world before it can become sweet. This is exactly what happened to Elijah. The author recalls how Elijah fled to a cave, just completely overwhelmed and defeated by his environment, pouring his broken heart out to God. He had tasted the bitterness, and man, it had completely broken his spirit.
Now check out this contrast. When Elijah was in that cave of despair, his emotional state made him spiritually blind. He could only see the failures. He only saw the fallen people he felt he had failed to save. But his perception was deeply flawed. The reality, as the text reveals, was a vast, unimaginable multitude from all nations standing in white robes praising God. His despair had basically created this massive blind spot.
Specifically, Elijah couldn't see the thousands of faithful followers that God had secretly preserved. He genuinely thought he was the absolute only one left. This is an incredibly powerful reminder of how hopelessness distorts our vision. When we feel overwhelmed by the evil in the world, we often assume the absolute worst, completely missing the quiet, resilient thousands who are still holding on to the light right alongside us.
This brings us to the climax of the text, section 4, the tearing heart, which reveals the true, visceral cost of empathy and love.
This captures the core theology of the entire letter. It explains exactly why loving the world hurts so much. Just imagine this. Your left hand is desperately holding on to a fallen sinner, trying to keep them from sinking further into the dark. At the exact same time, your right hand is holding on to Christ, who is powerfully pulling you upwards toward the light. So what happens in the middle? Your heart literally tears from the agonizing tension of being stretched between broken humanity and perfect divinity. But, and here's the beautiful part, as God heals those tears, your heart actually expands. Each healed wound creates more capacity to pour God's love back into the world. True love hurts, but it grows you. Enduring this agonizing stretch requires immense resolve. The text notes that the prophet knows this pain intimately. He has to let his face harden like flint. He has to willingly offer himself to the suffering, even offering his beard to be torn, which, by the way, was a symbol of ultimate humiliation in the ancient world, because he knows with absolute certainty that in the end, he will not be put to shame. He just accepts the suffering as part of the mission.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that earthly suffering isn't a punishment. In fact, the author delivers this stunning line. Even the angels in heaven envy us this. Why? Because angels don't suffer. Only humans have the unique, agonizing privilege of demonstrating our love for God by choosing to suffer for Him in a broken world. The author beautifully reassures his weary friend, saying, "They know you in heaven. Your struggle is seen, it's validated, and it is actually marveled at by celestial beings." No way, right? It's incredible.
Which brings us to part 5, illuminating the darkness. Having validated the pain, we finally arrive at the author's empowering call to action for his weary friend.
The directive here is incredibly clear and, honestly, quite challenging. Rather than retreating, rather than escaping to heaven to avoid the gloom, the believer is commanded to change the environment. If your surroundings are gloomy, don't just complain about the dark. Instead, become a sun, illuminated. You are called to actually resemble the light from light. You are supposed to actively embody the very thing you are desperately wishing you could see in the world.
Then, the author comforts his friend by pointing out a simple, undeniable physical truth. Think about the night sky. The deeper, the more overwhelming and absolute the darkness around us becomes, the more brilliantly even the tiniest, faintest star shines. You don't have to be a blinding sun to make a difference. Even if you only have the energy to be a tiny star from the constellation of Jesus Christ, your light is naturally magnified by the very darkness you're lamenting.
We end our explainer with this liberating final thought from the author, beautifully captured in this question. When we look at the world, we get crushed by the impossible weight of trying to fix it all. But the author says, actually, scratch that. That is not your job. You don't have to carry the burden of saving the entire world. Your only task, right where you are, is to lovingly turn the gaze of the fallen people around you toward Christ, even if just for a fleeting moment. It takes the weight of the world off your shoulders and replaces it with a simple act of directional love. So I leave you with this to ponder. In your own life, are you exhausting yourself trying to save everyone, or are you simply focusing on being that tiny star, pointing the way in the dark?